Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the third of three lecture videos dedicated to Immanuel Kant. And this third video is covering pages 351 through 356 of the reading assignment. And as I said at the closing of the previous video, the the emphasis on this video is going to be Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, which is really getting into the metaphysics and the metaphysical side of the theory of transcendental idealism. But I want to, before we get to that, I want to spend a little bit of time, further explaining some of the things that were mentioned toward the end of the previous video. And to get to that, I'm just going to jump right into reading this pink highlighted excerpt. Again, still, it's an excerpt from Kant's major work, The Critique of Pure Reason. And there, Immanuel Kant says, and thus I conclude the analytical solution of the main question which I had posed. So remember that question that Immanuel Kant starts off with: how is metaphysics possible? Now, the term metaphysics in Kant's day meant philosophy more generally. In today's usage, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy, but in Kant's day, metaphysics was the name for philosophy, and the reason for that is because philosophy was the name given to science. The word science didn't exist in Immanuel Kant's day. In Immanuel Kant's day, what we call scientists were called natural philosophers. And so the term philosopher had a shift in the late 1800s. That's when the word scientist was developed. 1891, I think, was its first actual appearance in usage. So in Kant's day, philosophy was science and metaphysics was epistemology. Metaphysics was philosophy. In today's usage, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy, and then science is what they called philosophy in Kant's day. So this question, how is metaphysics in general possible, is asking how is philosophy possible, right? Speaking specifically to Hume's question, how is it possible to have knowledge of things that haven't happened yet, right? How is it possible to have knowledge of the world that is necessary and universal? It's really easy to see how knowledge of mathematics and logical concepts is necessary and universal, right? For any object X, it is identical to itself. That's not a truth about the world, it's a truth of logic. If I tell you that all squares have four sides, that's not a truth about the world. Squares don't exist in the world, right? Square-shaped things exist in the world, but the geometrical construct of a square is not something which inhabits a physical world, right? It inhabits logical space, not physical space. So clearly, it's possible to have necessary and universal knowledge of truths of mathematics and logic and other types of a priori reason. But the question that Kant is interested in is, how is it possible to have necessary and universal knowledge of the world? Remember Hume's problem. Hume's going to say that we can't know that this pencil, which inhabits the world, is going to fall whenever I let it go. The most Hume says we can do is, point out that, well, we can't help but believe it. And by the way, Hume's going to say we shouldn't live our lives any differently, right? Go ahead and live your life as if you have knowledge of cause and effect relationships. Just realize that you don't actually have, knowledge of those things. So getting back to this quotation, how is metaphysics, philosophy in general, possible? By ascending, right? That distinction that we made in the previous video, or that Kant made and that we emphasized in the previous video. Kant says that all knowledge begins with experience, but it doesn't arise from it. So this word ascending here is arising. Knowledge doesn't arise from experience, it begins with experience. By ascending from the data of its actual use, as shown in its consequences, the grounds of its possibility. How is it possible to have an experience of objects? Remember this pencil. The newborn baby doesn't see an object here. The newborn baby, with its eyes open, right? It's having visual information. Sensory information is streaming into the baby's eyes, just as it's streaming into your eyes and my eyes. But that sensory information is different from the object. You see an object. I see an object. The newborn baby just experiences a blurb of light and color. And there's clearly a difference between an object and a blurb of light and color. So this, as an object, is a construction of the mind, right? The newborn baby's mind hasn't developed the ability to impose order on those sensations. This is why babies are screaming whenever they're born into the world, right? Because they're experiencing raw, unfiltered sensory data. If you're in that same birthing room as the newborn baby, you hear cell phones, you hear, conversations, you hear maybe a TV in the background or someone's playing music. You see pillows and blankets and faces. The newborn baby comes into that environment. The newborn baby doesn't hear a heart monitor. It doesn't know what the hell a heart monitor is, right? The newborn baby doesn't see a pillow. It doesn't know what the hell a pillow is. So it's experiencing all this auditory information, all this visual information, all this tactile information. The newborn baby doesn't feel a blanket. The newborn baby just experiences this detached sensation of roughness against its skin, right? You don't feel a detached sensation of roughness. You feel the pillow. You don't hear a detached, shrill sounding, wave. You hear a cell phone ringing. You have this active mind that is imposing order on those sensations. So the objects of perception are rendered perceptible objects by this construction of the mind. So that's what Kant is emphasizing here. So what Chafee is doing here in these sort of bulleted points is just kind of catching us back up on all these, the conclusions of these arguments that Kant has been making so far. So I'm going to go ahead and read this continue to read this pink highlighted passage. For Kant, Chafee says, remember John Chafee is the author of her textbook. For Kant, metaphysics refers to necessary and universal knowledge that we can use, that we can discover, that is a priori, that is obtained independently of experience. Of course, many empiricists accept the fact that tautologies, a bald man has no hair, which is to say that a bald man is a bald man, which is the same thing as saying that a dog is a dog, right? Those things are obviously true, but they're not truths about the world. They are logical relationships. And of course, we can know logical relationships a priori. The question is, can we have knowledge of the world that is necessary and universal? Kant thinks so, Hume doesn't. So, continuing on here, but Kant wants to claim another kind of a priori knowledge, synthetic a priori. So that's where we left off in the previous, where I left off in the previous video. So remember Hume's division of knowledge. Hume says that everything, all knowledge falls into one of two categories. It's either, if you know something, it's either knowable because it's a relation of ideas, that's the a priori, or it's knowable because it's a matter of fact, that's the a posteriori. And remember, Hume says that's exhaustive, right? That's it. That is the totality of knowledge. And then Hume says, well, causation's neither. Causation's not something we observed, because we only observe discrete events. We don't observe a cause, right? You observe somebody flipping the switch and you observe the lights coming on, but you didn't actually observe a cause, right? But neither is causation true by reason, right? Because go back to Hume's relation of ideas, what Hume says, well, you can always imagine the opposite of a matter of fact being the case, but you can't imagine the opposite of a relation of ideas. So you can imagine a world in which I have bright red curly hair. So if you say Dan Heber has bright red curly hair, you say something false, but you don't say something that is logically impossible, right? I could have bright red curly hair. It just so facts that I have short blonde hair. So going back to this notion of causation, what Hume is going to say is, well, you can imagine letting go of this pencil and it floating upward. You can imagine letting go of this pencil and it just staying there, or again, flying around the room like Yondu's pencil. So it's not a relation of ideas. So it's not something causation. It causation is not something that we observe, and it's not something which is true by definition. So therefore, we don't have knowledge of causation. Now we have a framework to understand how Kant is going to be rejecting Hume's conclusion. What Kant is going to say is that, yes, Hume, you're right. Causation is not a relation of ideas. Yes, Hume, you're right. Causation is not a matter of fact. But Hume, where you are wrong is because you left out a category of knowledge. The category of knowledge that you left out is the synthetic a priori. So what Kant is going to be doing is sort of updating Hume's language. Kant is going to say that what Hume described as a relation of ideas, that's analytic a priori. It's a priori, knowable in advance, and it's analytic in the sense that it's true by definition. What Hume meant to describe by a matter of fact, Kant's going to update that and call that the synthetic a posteriori. It's a posteriori in that it's a truth of observation, and it's synthetic in the sense that it's informative. And then Kant introduces this third category of knowledge, the synthetic a priori. A priori meaning that it's knowable in advance, and synthetic means that it informs us of something we didn't know before. So contrast that with the analytic a priori, Hume's examples of relations of ideas. If I tell you that a bachelor is an unmarried male, I tell you nothing that you didn't already know, right? It's not informative. If I tell you that my friend Aaron is an unmarried male, well, now you know something that you didn't know before. There's nothing about the definition of my friend Aaron that entails being unmarried, right? He could just as easily be married as he is unmarried. It just so happens to be the case that he's not married. But you can't even imagine what a married bachelor would be, right? A bachelor by definition is unmarried. So if I say a bachelor is an unmarried male, it's analytic a priori. It's analytic, true by definition. And precisely because it's true by definition, it's knowable a priori. But if I say my friend Aaron is an unmarried male, well, that's something that experience informs you. That's the a posteriori notion of it. And because it's dependent upon experience, that's what makes it informative. But what gives Kant this historical stature in philosophy is this introduction of the synthetic a priori, something which is knowable in advance. That's the a priori notion portion of it, but still is informative. And causation is one of Kant's examples of that category of knowledge. Causation is not true by definition. Causation is not a truth of experience. Causation doesn't exist out there waiting for us to discover it. All causation is the result of the active mind imposing order on sensations. Notice that little babies love to pick up objects and drop them, right? Because they don't know what's going to happen whenever they bang stuff together. They don't know what's going to happen whenever they take a spoon and throw it off their high chair. They're still figuring that out. You and I know, right, what's going to happen to the spoon. The baby doesn't, because the baby's mind hasn't developed this ability to impose order on its environment yet. So, to recap here, synthetic a priori, necessary and universal, right? The a priori can be discovered independently of experience, right? So it's not a posteriori, it's a priori. And it's synthetic in the sense that it's informative. It tells us something that we didn't know before. So now, let me scroll down here. Not sure why that's being so blurry. If I scroll too fast, a slow internet connection today. So I just want to emphasize that Kant gives several examples of the synthetic a priori. He thinks that our knowledge of space, time, geometry, mathematics all fall in the category of the synthetic a priori, meaning that it's knowable in advance and it's informative. We're just emphasizing causation here because Kant was inspired by the writings of David Hume, and that was Hume's major stalking horse. So a couple of excerpts from the textbook I want to read here. So John Chafee here in this yellow highlighted portion says, empiricists such as Locke, Berkeley, and Hume wondered How can we ever be sure that the external world exists? Remember, Locke's causal theory of perception. What Locke is going to say, I'm going to use my Yeti cup today, my purple Yeti cup. What Locke is going to say is that there is a physical object in the world that exists that is causing me to have certain kind of sensations, right? Is causing me to have this sort of purple sensation in my in my visual cortex. That there's this material that's causing a certain tactile sensation in my hand whenever I touch it. That there's something which is causing a certain auditory sensation whenever I wrap my knuckles against it. And thus I have this idea of the cup. And how do I have this idea of the cup? Well, it's a representation of something that is actually in the physical world. But how? What is the connection that exists between a representation, which is purely mental, and the cup itself, which is physical? How can the physical thing be like a non-physical thing, right? That's the problem that we had with empiricism, and that's what Jaffe is reminding us here. How can we know that the external world exists when all we encounter are sensations or impressions of this ultimately unknowable world? Kant's approach supersedes their concerns. What he means by supersedes just goes back to the name of Kant's theory, transcendental idealism, right? What Kant is asking about, he's not concerning himself with the experience of objects. Kant is interested in is what makes the experience of objects possible in the first place, right? And for that to happen in the first place, there's already got to be this cognitive structure in place. If we didn't already have that cognitive structure in place, we wouldn't perceive objects. Go back to the baby example, right? The baby doesn't see a pencil. The baby just sees a blurb of color and light. You see a pencil. It's an object. It's an object to you. It's not an object to the baby because the baby's mind hasn't imposed order on those sensations yet. Because our minds actively constitute the external world, right? Meaning that we're perceiving objects and not blurbs of color and light. Because our minds construct the world, there is no gap, right? So for traditional empiricists like Locke and Berkeley and Hume, there's something which is the source, the cause of these sensations in me. And that's what gives us a gap. Well, how can I know that my perception of the cup is inspired by the cup whenever I'm locked inside of my perceptual bubble? And if I'm locked inside my perceptual bubble, then I'm never going to be justified in making a claim about what the cup is independent of my perception of it, right? There's that forever unbridgeable gap between our mind, which is what we experience, and the object, which is on this view, independent of experience. Excuse me, I'm trying to talk through the hiccups here. So this pink highlighted passage, we are dealing with unified, integrated reality. That's Kant, in which our thinking and the external world it constitutes are necessary partners, inextricably connected to one another, right? So the world as we perceive it is necessarily the result of an active mind imposing itself on the world. That's Kant and his theory of transcendental idealism. And that's precisely what makes it possible for us to have knowledge of things that haven't happened yet, because our minds aren't these passive entities that are sitting there waiting for the world to impress itself on it, right? Kant is very specific about this. He says that our knowledge begins with experience. It doesn't arise from experience, right? Just because I have a visual sensation doesn't mean that I know what I'm looking at. Just think of the newborn baby example, right? The newborn baby doesn't hear a cell phone. It just hears this detached, auditory sensation. You don't experience a detached auditory sensation. You hear a phone ringing. And the difference between you and the newborn baby is that your mind is imposing order on those sensations. The ability to impose order in and of itself doesn't constitute knowledge. The brute sensation itself is not enough to merit the term of knowledge. It's the unification of those two things which is the source of knowledge. Okay, so now the real point that we want to talk about in this video, the distinction that Kant makes between phenomena and noumena. And Kant invented this terminology, by the way, and it's part of what made Immanuel Kant so bewildering whenever he first came on the scene. Not only was Kant talking about things that philosophers had never talked about before, he's quite literally making up words for the purpose of talking about things that have never been talked about before, which is why it took about 70 years before people started to understand what it was that Immanuel Kant was saying. So this distinction here between the phenomena and the noumena, the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. The noumenal world is what the world is in and of itself. The phenomenal world is the world as we perceive it. And what Kant is going to say, going to this pencil, that this pencil, remember for Kant, is a construction of the mind. That's the phenomena. And what Kant is going to say is that you and I cannot step outside of our cognitive framework and experience what the pencil is independently of that, because it's my cognitive framework that allows me to have a comprehension of the object. So whenever I talk about an object, I'm always talking about an object of comprehension, an object of cognition, but I can't have an object of cognition independent of that cognitive framework. So I can never know what the reality of the pencil is beyond my cognitive framework, because I'm stuck within my cognitive framework. I'm stuck within the phenomenal world. But what I know, what reason informs me, is that there just has to be a world in and of itself. There has to be that objective basis. The phenomenal world is subjective, but I can't have a subjective experience if there isn't something that exists objective, independent of my subjective experience, right? Because my mind isn't creating the sensory information. My mind's just imposing order on the sensory information. So the source of that sensory information clearly has to be external to me. And it's reason that informs me of that. I just can't know anything about it. So that's the distinction between phenomena and noumena. The phenomenal reality is the world as we constitute it, the world as we construct it. And how are we constructing it? Well, those two things, right? Sensations coming from the outside, order being imposed from the inside. It's the unification of those two things that constitute not only reality, but my knowledge of reality. This is both a metaphysical theory and an epistemological theory. The noumenal reality is the world that is beyond our perceptions, the in itself, what Kant called the Ding an sich, the thing unto itself. That's the noumenal world. We know that it has to exist, because if the noumenal world didn't exist, I would never have a phenomenal world. We can think of the noumenal world and the phenomenal world as being sort of equivalent to what in today's usage is referred to as, virtual reality versus reality. And just as a virtual reality presupposes an actual reality, right? We can't have a virtual reality environment if there weren't such a thing as reality. A virtual reality is parasitic upon an actual reality. So if you've heard of the simulation hypothesis, this idea that we're all just sort of trapped in this virtual reality environment, that's basically what Kant is saying, that we are in fact caught in this virtual reality environment, because that's the only way we can process the information, because our mind is imposing order on those sensations. We cannot step outside of our cognitive structures and experience the world as it is, because then we would just have unfiltered sensory data, and unfiltered sensory data is not knowledge. And I think I'm going to allow the external resources serve you in finishing out the remaining pages. I've already been going for almost 25 minutes now. There is an abundance of very good external resources that I'm including in the module for this unit. And as I've said before, these lectures are not intended to be an exhaustive resource for you. I'm giving you a bunch of additional resources to help you comprehend this material, and I'm trying to keep these video lectures in digestible bites. So with all those things being said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this video to a close. I'm going to ask you to enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll be in contact. Well, I'll see you again in the next video.